All right, you beautifully exhausted scholar of absolutely nothing tonight. I'm glad you made it. If your brain has been running in small, anxious circles all day, we're about to give it a field to wander instead. Tonight, we're stepping back to the calm education system of the ancient Celts, where there were no pop quizzes, no alarm clocks, and definitely no group projects. Learning unfolded slowly beneath open skies, carried by memory, voice, and long seasons of listening. If you're new here, feel free to subscribe and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Now let your shoulders drop, let the day loosen its grip, and we'll begin. Long before classrooms and textbooks, before the first stone schoolhouse rose in any European village, the Celtic peoples of Britain and Gaul developed a system of learning that required no buildings at all. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 800 BCE to 100 CE, knowledge passed from one generation to the next through spoken word, natural observation, and patient repetition beneath open skies. Tonight, we'll explore how an entire civilization educated its children without ever writing down a single lesson plan. You're standing in a clearing somewhere in what would one day become southern England, though no one here would recognize that name. The year is approximately 300 BCE, and the morning fog hasn't quite lifted from the valley below. Around you, oak trees rise like pillars in a temple that was never built by human hands. Their branches create a canopy overhead, filtering the early light into something soft and dappled. This is where learning happens. No bell rings to signal the start of lessons. No rows of desks wait to be filled. Instead, about 15 children ranging from perhaps 6 years old to their early teens are gathering near a particular tree, one with a trunk so wide that 3 adults holding hands couldn't encircle it. They arrive gradually, some alone, some walking with older siblings. There's no rush, because there's no specific time when education officially begins. It simply unfolds as naturally as the day itself. The youngest ones carry nothing in their hands. The older children might have small leather pouches containing a piece of bread or dried meat for later, but that's all. There are no slates, no chalk, no papyrus or parchment. The absence of these things isn't a sign of poverty or primitiveness. It's intentional. What you're about to witness is an educational philosophy that considers memory more reliable than anything that can be written down and experience more valuable than anything that can be read. An older woman approaches the group. She's perhaps 45, which in this time and place makes her genuinely old, someone who has survived illnesses and winters that claimed many others. Her hair is braided in a complex pattern that took considerable time to create, and she wears a cloak dyed a deep blue, a color that requires significant effort to produce and therefore signals importance. But she doesn't announce herself or demand attention. She simply sits on a fallen log and waits. The children notice her and begin to settle. This happens gradually, in waves rather than all at once. The youngest ones stop their play first, sensing the shift in atmosphere. The older children finish their conversations and find places to sit on the ground. No one tells them to be quiet. The silence arrives on its own, spreading like the growing light through the morning mist. This woman isn't what we would call a teacher exactly, though that's the closest English word we have for her role. She's a keeper of certain knowledge, stories, plant lore, seasonal wisdom, and the names of ancestors going back 7 generations. She learned these things from someone older when she was young, and now it's her turn to pass them along. It's not her only job in the community, but it's one she performs several times each week during the seasons when farm work permits. Notice how quiet the birds are right now, she says, and that's how the lesson begins. Not with a greeting or an announcement of the day's topic, but with an observation about the immediate world around them. Several children tilt their heads, suddenly aware that the dawn chorus has indeed faded. One boy, perhaps 10 years old, volunteers that they were loud just before sunrise. The woman nods but doesn't praise or correct. She's simply gathering information about what they've noticed. This approach to education, starting with what's immediately present, building from observation rather than abstraction, characterizes everything that will follow. The Celts didn't separate learning from living. There was no artificial environment created specifically for instruction, no special time carved out when real life was supposed to pause so education could happen. Instead, the natural world provided both the classroom and much of the curriculum. The clearing where these children gather has been used this way for generations, but it's not the only learning space. Throughout the territory controlled by their tribe, there are dozens of such places. A particular bend in the river where fish behavior can be observed, a hillside where certain herbs grow, a grove of hazel trees that produce nuts in autumn, and a stone outcropping that catches the light at the summer solstice. Each location teaches something different, and children will visit all of them many times throughout their youth. What's remarkable is how little this resembles what we think of as school. No one takes attendance. There's no punishment for absence, because the concept of compulsory education doesn't exist. Children come to these sessions because the knowledge being shared is genuinely useful, because the adults transmitting it are respected, and because there's a social expectation that young people should learn their culture's accumulated wisdom. But the learning itself is voluntary in a way that would seem foreign to anyone who grew up with modern schooling. The woman stands and walks toward the edge of the clearing. The children follow without being asked. She's heading toward a particular plant, one that grows in the shade at the forest's border. When she reaches it, she kneels, and the children form a loose semicircle around her. Some sit, some crouch, and some stand. There's no instruction about how to position themselves. They simply arrange their bodies in whatever way allows them to see and hear. This one is useful when someone has been coughing for many days, she says, touching the plant's leaves gently. But only the leaves, picked when they're still new and soft. Later in the season, they become too bitter and can make the sickness worse instead of better. She doesn't pick the plant to demonstrate. She doesn't crush the leaves to release their scent. She simply points and describes, expecting the children to remember based on her words and the plant's appearance. One of the older girls asks how you prepare it. The woman describes the process, how many leaves, how much water, how long to let it steep, and how to know when it's ready. She uses comparisons the children understand. The amount of water that would fill a certain type of bowl everyone owns, and the time it takes for the sun to move the width of your hand across the sky. Nothing is written down. The girl who asked is expected to remember, and she does, because forgetting might mean someone in her family suffers unnecessarily next winter. This is education as a survival skill, but it's also more than that. The woman doesn't just share practical knowledge. She tells them that her grandmother taught her this, and that her grandmother learned it from her own mother, who learned it from the druids themselves. She's placing this information in a lineage, giving it weight and context. The plant isn't just useful, it's part of their heritage, a gift from the past that they're now responsible for carrying into the future. After perhaps 20 minutes, the woman stands and walks to a different part of the clearing. The lesson on medicinal plants is over, though there was no formal conclusion, no summary of what was covered, and no test to see who was paying attention. The children who will need this knowledge, particularly the girls, who are more likely to be responsible for healing in their future households, have absorbed it. Those who were less attentive or too young to fully understand will hear it again, maybe next month, maybe next year. Repetition is built into the system. Now, she's going to tell them a story, and this is where the educational philosophy of the Celts becomes truly distinctive. The story isn't entertainment separate from education, and it isn't a simple moral tale designed to teach behavior. It's encoded history, law, geography, and cultural memory all woven together in narrative form. It's how a society without written records preserves everything that matters. The children settle again. Story time requires a different kind of attention, one that's both more relaxed and more focused. They're about to hear something they may have heard before, possibly many times. But each telling adds layers of understanding. As they grow older, different aspects of the same story become relevant. A tale that entertains a 6-year-old with its adventure might teach a 14-year-old about property boundaries or marriage customs. The woman begins, "This happened in the time when your great-great-grandparents were young." And just like that, abstract history becomes personal, connected to specific people whose names the children know from other stories. The Celts didn't think in terms of dates or dynasties. They thought in generations, in lineages of memory that stretched backward through named individuals until the thread became too thin to follow clearly. This is how an entire civilization taught its children without schools. Not through formal instruction or standardized curriculum, but through observation, repetition, storytelling, and direct transmission of knowledge from those who had lived longer to those who had just arrived. It's tempting to romanticize this system, to imagine it as some perfect alternative to modern education. But it's also worth understanding it on its own terms, as a sophisticated response to the needs of a particular time and place. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher, this informal gathering will continue. The woman will share more plant knowledge, tell another story, and perhaps demonstrate how to identify animal tracks in soft earth. Later, some of the older boys might break away to learn hunting skills from the men, while older girls might join the women preparing food, their education continuing through apprenticeship and observation rather than formal lessons. There are no walls around this education, no boundaries between learning time and living time. And that's exactly the point. You're sitting with the same group of children now, but several weeks have passed. The season has shifted slightly. There's a crispness to the air that wasn't there before, and some of the plants in the clearing have already begun their slow fade toward autumn dormancy. Today, the person leading this gathering is different. A man in his late 30s with a scar across his left forearm and hands that show years of working leather. He's not speaking yet. He's been sitting in silence for what feels like a long time, maybe 10 minutes, just listening to the sounds of the forest. Some of the younger children are getting restless, shifting their weight, glancing at each other. But the older ones have learned to wait. They understand that this silence is itself a lesson, though they might not be able to articulate exactly what they're supposed to learn from it. Finally, the man speaks. "Tell me what you heard." The children look confused. They heard nothing? Everything? A young girl, maybe 7, offers tentatively, "Birds." The man nods but doesn't respond further. An older boy adds, "Wind in the trees." Another nod. This continues for a while. Small sounds catalogued, noticed, and named. The man doesn't correct anyone or suggest they've missed something. He's simply collecting their observations. Then he asks a different question. "Did anyone hear the stream?" This creates confusion. Several children turn their heads, listening more carefully now. There's a small creek about 50 paces from where they're sitting, but they hadn't noticed it during their inventory of sounds. Now, once it's been pointed out, they can hear the faint gurgle of water moving over stones. It was there the entire time, but they weren't listening for it. "When you're tracking an animal," the man explains, "you need to hear what the animal would hear. A deer knows where water is without looking for it. The sound tells her. She knows which direction the wind is blowing by how the leaves move and whisper. If you're trying to follow her, you need to know these things too." This is how Celtic children learned to listen, not as a passive act, but as active engagement with the world. Hearing wasn't enough. They had to learn to distinguish between sounds, to understand what different noises meant, and to build a mental map of their environment based on acoustic information. This skill had obvious survival value in a world where hunting and foraging were essential. but it also had deeper cultural significance. In a society without writing, listening was the primary way knowledge was transferred between generations. Celtic education depended entirely on students who could pay attention, remember what they heard, and recall it accurately when needed. This wasn't a skill you could fake or supplement with written notes. Either you developed the ability to truly listen, or you remained ignorant of your culture's accumulated wisdom. The training started young, often before children were old enough to fully understand why it mattered. Parents would ask small children to carry messages between households, testing their ability to remember and repeat words exactly. "Go tell your uncle that we'll bring the grain tomorrow after the morning meal" might seem like a simple errand, but it required the child to hold several pieces of information in mind, deliver them in the right order, and not add or subtract anything from the original message. As children grew older, the complexity increased. They might be asked to remember and repeat entire poems or legal formulas dozens of lines long. They would sit through lengthy recitations by druids or bards, expected to absorb the content without any written reference to study later. The pressure to remember was real, because forgetting could have serious consequences. If you couldn't remember the traditional boundaries of your family's land, you might lose that land in a dispute. If you couldn't recall the proper procedures for a religious ceremony, you might offend the gods. But the Celts also understood that listening was more than just memorization. It was interpretation, context, and understanding subtext. When a tribal elder told a story about a hero's journey, children were expected to hear not just the plot, but also the underlying lessons about courage, loyalty, or wisdom. When a poet performed a satire, young people needed to catch the references to current events and understand why certain lines made adults laugh or wince. The man with the scarred arm is now teaching the children a different kind of listening, the ability to detect emotional content in speech. He asks one of the older boys to tell the group about something that happened recently. The boy describes finding a hawk's nest last week. As he speaks, the man stops him periodically and asks the other children, "Is he excited or worried right now? How can you tell?" They discuss the subtle cues, the speed of speech, the pitch changes, and the places where the boy paused. This isn't psychology as we'd understand it, but it's a practical education in reading human communication beyond just the words themselves. In a culture where contracts weren't written and disputes were settled through spoken arguments, the ability to hear what someone really meant was crucial. One reason Celtic education emphasized listening so heavily was that sound was considered more reliable than sight. This seems counterintuitive to modern people who trust visual evidence above almost everything else, but the Celts had their reasons. Things you see can be illusions, tricks of light, or deliberate deceptions. But sounds, particularly natural sounds, follow predictable patterns. A stream sounds a certain way when it's full versus when it's low. Birds make specific calls when a predator is near. The wind changes its voice before a storm arrives. Children learn to build a sonic map of their world. They knew what their home valley sounded like at different times of day and year. They could hear the difference between their own cattle and a neighboring tribe's animals. They developed the ability to judge distances by sound, to locate sources of noise with remarkable accuracy, and to detect subtle changes that signaled danger or opportunity. This education happened constantly, not just during formal gatherings. Parents would quiz children while walking through the forest. "What's that sound? Where is it coming from? How far away?" They would wake children before dawn and ask them to identify birds by their calls. They would have young people close their eyes and listen to approaching footsteps, learning to recognize individuals by their gait. The woman who taught plant knowledge returns to the clearing and joins the man. Now they're going to demonstrate something that appears almost magical to the younger children. A conversation carried on across a distance too far for normal speech. One of them walks to the far edge of the clearing, while the other stays with the children. Then they begin communicating, using a series of whistles and bird-like calls. To the children, it's fascinating. To the adults, it's a practical communication technique that has been refined over generations. But it's also a lesson in listening, because after the demonstration, both teachers work with the children on producing these sounds themselves. It's harder than it looks. Your mouth has to be positioned exactly right. The breath has to be controlled carefully, and you have to be able to hear the difference between a call that means come here and one that means stay away. This takes practice, lots of it, and most of the younger children aren't successful today. They'll try again next week and the week after that, until eventually the skill becomes second nature. This is typical of Celtic education. Skills were introduced early, practiced repeatedly, and mastered gradually over years. There was no rush, no sense that a child had to accomplish something by a certain age. Development happened at its own pace. As the afternoon wears on, the teachers move on to another aspect of listening education, learning to hear stories within stories. The woman tells a tale that on its surface is about a hero defeating a monster, but embedded within it are descriptions of the landscape where the battle took place. Descriptions so detailed that anyone familiar with local geography would recognize a specific location. She's encoding a territorial claim in narrative form. The older children pick up on this. You can see it in their faces when recognition dawns. The younger ones just enjoy the adventure story, which is fine. They'll hear it again as they grow, and each time they'll understand more layers. This is the genius of oral education. The same content can teach different lessons at different ages. Before the gathering ends, the man poses one final challenge. He produces a leather pouch and shakes it gently, creating a soft, rattling sound. "Tell me what's inside," he says. The children guess. Stones, seeds, small bones, and pieces of metal. Each guess is met with another shake, another chance to listen more carefully. Finally, he opens the pouch and shows them carved wooden beads, each one slightly different in size. "You can learn to hear differences this small," he tells them. "It just takes practice and attention." He's teaching them that their ears can be trained, that listening is a skill that improves with use, and that the world contains more information than they currently know how to access. This message, that learning is always possible, that your abilities can always develop further, is perhaps the most important lesson of all. The children will come back next time, ready to listen more carefully, to pay attention to subtler distinctions, and to engage more fully with the sonic landscape around them. And gradually, without anyone announcing it or measuring it, they'll become the kind of listeners their society requires. People who can remember what they hear, understand what's really being communicated, and preserve knowledge through the fragile but powerful medium of sound. You're now inside a roundhouse as winter darkness settles early over the land. This is several months after those autumn gatherings, and the weather no longer permits outdoor education. But learning doesn't stop when the cold arrives. It simply moves inside, taking on different forms and addressing different kinds of knowledge. The interior of this dwelling is warm from a central fire, and smoke rises toward the thatched roof, where it eventually finds its way out through small openings. About 20 people are present, including the children you've been following. They're arranged in a loose circle around the fire, close enough for warmth, but not so close that the heat becomes uncomfortable. An elderly man is speaking, and everyone is absolutely still, listening with the kind of focused attention that has become second nature to even the youngest children present. He's reciting genealogy, the names and relationships of ancestors going back further than anyone can remember. This sounds unbearably dry to modern ears, like reading names from a phone book, but for the Celts, it was vital cultural information. These names established who had rights to which land, who could claim kinship with whom, who had status within the tribe, and who didn't. This was their legal system, their historical record, and their identity all compressed into memorized lists of who begat whom. The old man doesn't rush. He pauses between each generation, giving listeners time to absorb the information and mentally connect it to what they already know. When he mentions a name that carries particular significance, he sometimes adds a brief phrase of description: who was known for his generosity with cattle, or who settled the dispute over the western boundary. These tags help people remember and also encode additional historical information. The children are learning something that would be impossible for most modern people: how to hold vast amounts of information in memory without any external support. No written notes, no reference books to consult. Just the human brain trained to store and retrieve knowledge through techniques that have been refined over countless generations. Celtic memory training began with the understanding that memory is not a single thing, but several different capacities working together. There was rote memory for exact repetition, essential for legal formulas, religious invocations, and traditional poetry. There was narrative memory for stories with plots and characters. There was spatial memory for geographical knowledge. And there was what we might call associative memory, the ability to connect different pieces of information through meaningful relationships. Children learned early that memory was both a gift and a responsibility. Those who showed particular aptitude for memorization were identified young and given additional training. They might spend years learning under a druid or a bard, absorbing the enormous body of knowledge that such specialists carried. But even children without exceptional memory were expected to develop strong recall abilities because their survival and social functioning depended on it. The techniques they used are still studied today. They organized information into rhythmic patterns because rhythm aids memory. This is why so much Celtic knowledge was transmitted in poetic form. They used vivid imagery because the human brain remembers pictures more easily than abstractions. They created mental palaces, imaginary locations where different pieces of information were stored in specific places, centuries before medieval Europeans invented this technique. But perhaps most importantly, they understood that memory improves through use. The old man reciting genealogy tonight isn't doing it once and expecting everyone to remember perfectly. He's doing it regularly, probably several times each winter, knowing that repetition over time is what creates lasting memory. The children hearing these names for the first time will hear them again next month, next year, and the year after that. Eventually, through sheer repetition and the gradual deepening of understanding that comes with age, they'll know this material as thoroughly as the old man does. A young woman, perhaps 16, is asked to recite a portion of what she's just heard. This happens without warning. Suddenly the old man pauses and points to her, and everyone's attention shifts. She takes a breath and begins, speaking carefully, but confidently. She gets most of it right, but stumbles over one name that's particularly difficult to pronounce. The old man corrects her gently, has her repeat it correctly 3 times, then nods for her to continue. This is teaching through public performance, which creates a different kind of pressure than private study. The young woman knows everyone is listening, evaluating, and noting her accuracy or lack thereof. But this isn't meant to humiliate. It's practical preparation for the day when she might be called upon to recite this information in a legal context, where accuracy could determine land ownership or inheritance rights. After the genealogy lesson, there's a shift in atmosphere. Someone produces a small harp, and the educational content changes from rote memorization to what might be called cultural literacy. The musician begins playing a tune that everyone clearly recognizes. You can see it in the way people sit up slightly, smiling in anticipation. Then he starts singing, and the song tells the story of a cattle raid, a classic theme in Celtic culture. But this isn't just entertainment. The song encodes information about cattle value, about proper procedures for raiding and counter-raiding, and about the complex social rules that governed warfare between tribes. A child listening to this song learns what makes a hero heroic, what qualities are valued in a leader, and how warriors should behave even toward enemies. The information isn't presented as moral instruction. It's embedded in a narrative that makes it memorable and emotionally resonant. The Celtic educational system understood something that modern research has confirmed. We remember stories better than lists, emotions better than facts, and personal experiences better than abstract information. So they packaged everything: history, law, ethics, practical knowledge, in forms that the human brain naturally retains. An older boy, around 14, is asked to sing a verse. He does so, somewhat self-consciously, and his voice cracks on a high note, which makes several younger children giggle. But the musician nods approvingly and asks him to sing it again. The second time is better. The third time, encouraged to relax and just enjoy the song, is actually quite good. This boy is learning that performance skills can be developed and that initial awkwardness gives way to competence with practice. Later, when the fire has burned lower and the youngest children are drowsy, someone begins telling a different kind of story, one that weaves together several threads of earlier lessons. It references plants they learned about in autumn, includes characters whose names appeared in tonight's genealogy recitation, and describes landscape features the children have actually visited. This interconnection is deliberate. Celtic education didn't compartmentalize knowledge into separate subjects. Everything connected to everything else, creating a web of understanding that grew more complex and interconnected over time. A girl who has been quiet all evening suddenly speaks up with a question about something in the story that seems inconsistent with a different version she heard last year. The storyteller considers this carefully before responding. Yes, there are different versions. Some families tell it one way, some another. Both might be true, or maybe the truth is somewhere between them. This is an important lesson. Oral traditions have flexibility built into them, and absolute certainty isn't always possible or even desirable. This acknowledgement of ambiguity might seem at odds with the emphasis on accurate memorization, but the Celts didn't see it that way. Some knowledge needed to be preserved exactly: legal formulas, boundary descriptions, and religious procedures. Other knowledge could tolerate variation as long as the core meaning remained consistent. Knowing which was which required judgment and cultural competency that only developed over years of immersion. As the evening winds down, the elderly man who began with genealogy offers a brief observation that serves as a kind of summation. He notes that the youngest child present tonight will likely live to see children of their own, learning these same stories around a winter fire. That child will be the old one then, the keeper of memory, the living bridge between past and future. This is why memory matters, not just for practical reasons, but because it's how a people persist across time. The children file out into the cold night, and you follow them. Their heads are full of names, stories, songs, and images. Nothing has been written down. There are no homework assignments, no tests scheduled, and no grades recorded. But learning has occurred, deep and thorough, the kind that becomes part of who you are, rather than just something you know. In a few weeks, there will be another gathering, more stories, more names, and more layers added to the foundation being built. And gradually, through this patient accumulation of memory, these children will become the living archives of their culture. You're standing on a hillside at dawn, watching a small group of older students approach a figure who waits beneath an ash tree. These aren't children anymore. The youngest is perhaps 16, and the oldest is in their early 20s. They've been selected for specialized training, and today they begin a form of education that will last for years, possibly decades. The person waiting for them is a druid, though that word carries so many layers of meaning that it's difficult to translate into modern terms. Scholar, priest, legal expert, physician, teacher, philosopher, poet. All of these apply, yet none quite captures the full role. In Celtic society, druids formed an intellectual elite whose knowledge was considered so valuable and dangerous that it could never be written down. This prohibition against writing wasn't primitive superstition. It was a deliberate choice based on the belief that knowledge transmitted orally from teacher to student in an unbroken chain of memory was more reliable and sacred than anything committed to lifeless marks on wood or stone. Writing, when the Celts encountered it through contact with Mediterranean civilizations, was rejected as a method of preserving important knowledge. They used it for practical matters like trade records, but the deep wisdom of their culture remained exclusively oral. The druid who waits beneath the tree is a woman, perhaps 50 years old, with silver grey hair and eyes that seem to catalogue everything they observe. Her presence carries authority that requires no announcement or assertion. When she speaks, her voice is quiet, almost conversational, but the students lean in to catch every word. "Tell me what you remember from the winter teachings," she says, and this begins an examination that will last for hours. One by one, the students recite passages they learned over the previous months: poetry, genealogy, legal formulas, and astronomical observations. The druid listens without interruption, her face showing nothing. Only when each student has finished does she offer brief commentary, pointing out where memory has failed or where understanding remains shallow. This is how druidic education worked: constant testing, relentless repetition, and gradual deepening of knowledge over years of intensive study. Ancient sources claim that training to become a druid could take 20 years, and while that might be an exaggeration, it suggests the enormous scope of what these students were attempting to master. The curriculum, to the extent we can reconstruct it, was vast. Students learned astronomy and timekeeping, essential in a society that organized itself around agricultural cycles and religious festivals tied to celestial events. They learned natural philosophy, what we might call early science, including observation of animal behavior, weather patterns, and the properties of plants. They studied law in extensive detail, memorizing the precedents and procedures that governed everything from marriage contracts to tribal warfare. But perhaps most importantly, they learned poetry and the art of composition. This wasn't literature as entertainment. It was a technology for preserving and transmitting knowledge. Everything a druid needed to know was encoded in poetic form, because rhythm, meter, and formulaic language made memorization easier and corruption of the text less likely. A student who could compose in traditional meters demonstrated not just creative ability, but deep understanding of how knowledge itself was structured and preserved. The druid leads her students to a different part of the hillside, where a natural spring emerges from between rocks. She points to the water and asks what laws govern its use. The students respond with memorized formulas that establish water rights, describe proper procedures for resolving disputes over access, and explain the religious significance of certain springs. One student adds a detail about how drought conditions modify these rules, showing that she understands the law isn't just rote memorization, but the application of principles to varying circumstances. This pleases the druid, though her expression barely changes. She moves on to the next topic, the calendar. She asks them to calculate when the next major festival will occur, based on observations of the moon and their knowledge of the standard Celtic year. This requires them to demonstrate mathematical thinking, observational astronomy, and cultural memory all at once. 2 students give the correct answer immediately. A third arrives at it more slowly, but with clear reasoning. The last struggles, and the druid assigns him additional observation exercises to improve his understanding. What's striking about druidic education is its completeness. These students aren't specializing in narrow fields. They're attempting to master the entire body of knowledge their culture considers important. A fully trained druid could serve as priest, judge, physician, teacher, and advisor to kings, This required intellectual capacity of a high order, but it also required phenomenal memory and dedication to a training program that consumed decades of life. The morning progresses into a session on what we might call natural science. The druid has the students identify plants and describe their properties, not just medicinal uses, but seasonal growth patterns, preferred habitat, and relationship to other species. She asks them to explain why certain animals behave differently at different times of year, what this reveals about the natural order, and how this knowledge might be applied to human concerns like hunting or animal husbandry. Then she shifts without warning into something more abstract, a philosophical question about the nature of existence. Do animals have souls? If so, are they different from human souls? What happens to these souls after death? The students offer various answers based on teachings they've received, but the druid pushes them to think beyond mere repetition. She wants to know their reasoning, whether they can defend their positions, and whether they've truly understood the implications of what they've memorized. This intellectual rigor distinguished druidic education from the more practical learning available to ordinary Celtic children. Not everyone needed to think deeply about cosmology or debate the finer points of legal philosophy. But those who would serve as society's intellectual leaders needed these skills and needed to be able to think clearly, argue persuasively, and apply general principles to specific situations. Around midday, the group pauses for a simple meal. The druid doesn't eat with them, but observes as they share food and conversation. She's assessing them constantly, noting who shares generously, who speaks thoughtfully, and who listens well to others. Character matters as much as intellectual ability in a druid. Someone who will wield significant power through their knowledge and authority must be trustworthy, balanced, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of the community. After the meal, the druid introduces new material, a lengthy poem that encodes tribal history going back several generations. She recites it once, then has each student attempt portions of it. They stumble through it, making mistakes, forgetting lines, and mixing up the order. She shows no frustration. This is expected. She'll recite it again tomorrow, and they'll try again, and gradually, through repetition over weeks and months, they'll absorb it completely. This patience is characteristic of Celtic education at all levels, but especially in druidic training. There was no hurry. Knowledge accumulated slowly, like sediment building up year after year until it formed solid bedrock. The druid herself spent decades as a student before she could teach others. She understands the process from the inside and knows that forcing rapid progress produces shallow learning that doesn't last. Late in the afternoon, she assigns them tasks to complete before their next meeting. One student must compose original poetry in a specific meter about a particular historical event. Another must observe the night sky and report on the positions of certain stars. A third must research a legal question by consulting with elders and memorizing their explanations. These assignments are individualized, based on each student's weaknesses and the specific knowledge gaps the druid has identified. As evening approaches and the students prepare to leave, the druid offers a final observation. She notes that they're learning not just information, but a way of thinking, a methodology for approaching problems and organizing knowledge. This methodology, attention to pattern, reliance on memory, and respect for tradition combined with capacity for reasoned judgment, is perhaps her most important teaching. The specific facts they memorize will serve them throughout their lives, but the mental discipline they're developing will serve their communities for generations. You watch the students depart, each one heading toward their home village to practice, memorize, and prepare for the next session. Their education is voluntary in one sense. They could quit at any time, but in another sense, it's an obligation they've accepted by demonstrating the capacity for this level of learning. Celtic society needed druids, needed people who could master and preserve the elaborate body of knowledge that held everything together. These students, whether they complete their training or not, are attempting something genuinely difficult: to become living repositories of civilization itself. You're walking through territory you've seen before, but this time you're experiencing it differently. A druid is leading a group of students on what he calls a boundary teaching, and every stone marker, every ancient tree, and every bend in the stream has become a lesson waiting to be learned. Celtic education didn't happen exclusively in clearings or around winter fires. Much of it took place while moving through the landscape, learning to read the land itself as a text full of meaning and information. This wasn't just geographical knowledge, it was legal, historical, practical, and spiritual education all woven together. The druid stops at a stream that forms part of the boundary between two tribal territories. He asks the students what they notice. The obvious answer is the water itself, but he wants more than that. One student points out that the stream bed shows signs of seasonal flooding. There are marks on the rocks indicating where high water typically reaches. Another notices that certain trees grow only on one side of the stream, suggesting different soil conditions. A third observes that fish are visible in a particular pool where the water deepens. All of these observations matter for different reasons. The flood patterns determine where it's safe to build structures and where livestock can safely graze during wet seasons. The trees indicate soil fertility and suggest which side is better for certain crops. The fish pool represents a resource that might be shared between communities or claimed by one group based on traditional use rights. The druid begins teaching them the formal boundary description, a memorized formula passed down through generations that establishes where one territory ends and another begins. It's not written anywhere. It exists only in the memories of those who have learned it, and disputes over land often hinge on which group can produce someone who can recite the traditional boundaries most convincingly. The formula uses the landscape itself as reference points. From the twisted oak, where 3 branches grow from one trunk, following the stream to the place where the old ford once crossed, then up the hill to the standing stone that shows marks from ancient lightning. It continues like this for quite some time, creating a mental map that's tied to physical features anyone can verify. This method of boundary description required intimate knowledge of the landscape. You couldn't learn it from a map because maps didn't exist in any useful form. You had to walk the land repeatedly, fixing each landmark in memory, understanding how seasonal changes might affect visibility or access. The students follow the druid along the boundary line, and he tests them constantly. What comes after the split boulder? Which side of the hawthorn hedge belongs to which tribe? When does this stream run dry? But the teaching extends beyond mere boundary knowledge. As they walk, the druid points out plants that have medicinal value, explains which trees produce the best wood for different purposes, identifies animal tracks and droppings, and notes the direction of prevailing winds. The landscape becomes a living textbook of practical information. He also tells them stories tied to specific locations. At a particular hill, something significant happened 3 generations ago. A battle, or a meeting between tribal leaders, or a murder that required legal resolution. The story isn't just entertainment. It encodes legal precedent and historical memory. Future generations will need to know what happened here because it might become relevant in disputes or decision-making. This practice of tying stories to landscape features is found in oral cultures worldwide, and it serves powerful memory functions. It's much easier to remember information when it's associated with a specific place you've actually visited than when it exists only as abstract text. The students will be able to recall these stories for decades because they can mentally revisit the locations where they learned them. The group reaches an ancient burial mound, and the druid's tone shifts. This is sacred ground. but it's also an important landmark that figures in several boundary descriptions. He teaches them the proper way to approach such places, certain words to speak, certain gestures to make, and certain times of year when the site is particularly significant. This is religious education, but it's also cultural literacy. Someone who doesn't know how to behave respectfully at such sites marks themselves as an outsider, or, worse, as ignorant of their own traditions. They continue walking, and the landscape continues teaching. The druid shows them how to read weather signs in the sky and in animal behavior. He points out where different tribes traditionally gather certain resources, a particular hillside for nuts, a stretch of forest for hunting, a meadow where healing herbs grow abundantly. He explains the sometimes complex rules governing access to these resources, rules that exist nowhere in writing but are enforced through social pressure and occasional legal proceedings. At one point, the group reaches a spot where 3 territories meet. This is always a sensitive area, a place where careful knowledge of boundaries becomes crucial. The druid has them recite the relevant portions of boundary descriptions from all 3 perspectives, showing how the same physical features might be described differently by different groups. This teaches them that memory and perception aren't always identical to truth, and that disputes can arise from honest disagreement about how to interpret what everyone can see. The landscape also teaches seasonality in ways that no abstract calendar could match. The druid points out a particular tree that blooms early each spring. When its flowers appear, it's time to plant certain crops. He shows them a hillside where snow always lingers latest, useful for determining when the last frost danger has passed. He notes a stone that catches the sunrise in a particular way, only around the summer solstice. These natural markers were how the Celts organized their agricultural year, and learning to read them was essential education for anyone who would grow food or raise animals. As afternoon fades, the group makes its way back, taking a different route that covers new territory. The druid continues teaching, tireless in his attention to detail. He stops frequently, sometimes to point out something specific, sometimes simply to let the students observe and report what they notice. He's training them to be observant, to register and remember details that might seem insignificant but could prove crucial. By the time they return to the starting point, the students have covered perhaps 10 miles, and their heads are full of information. They know boundary lines, plant locations, story sites, weather signs, resource areas, and sacred places. They've learned through their feet and eyes as much as through their ears. The landscape has taught them, and when they return to this territory in the future, every feature they've studied today will trigger memories of the lessons learned. This method of education, using physical geography as both the content and the container of knowledge, created a profound connection between people and place. Modern people can move to new cities and learn street names from maps, find locations through GPS, and navigate without developing any deep relationship with the landscape. But for the Celts, knowing the land wasn't optional or superficial. It was identity, livelihood, legal standing, and spiritual connection all rolled into one. The students will return to this territory many times throughout their training, and each visit will add layers to their understanding. They'll learn the landscape in different seasons, different weather conditions, and different times of day. They'll memorize it so thoroughly that they could walk it in complete darkness and still know exactly where they are. This is education that engages the whole person, mind, body, memory, and emotion, in service of knowledge that will literally ground them for the rest of their lives. You're now sitting in a different kind of gathering, one that carries more formal weight than the informal teaching sessions you've observed before. This is a legal assembly where disputes are resolved and traditional law is publicly recited and applied. But it's also, fundamentally, an educational event where the community's younger members learn the elaborate system of rules and customs that govern their society. The setting is a large open area near the center of the tribe's territory, a place that has been used for such gatherings for generations. Perhaps 200 people are present, which represents most of the adult population and many children old enough to benefit from watching the proceedings. They're arranged in a loose semicircle, with the most senior members positioned nearest to the center, where cases will be heard. A man stands to present a grievance. His neighbor's pigs broke through a fence and damaged his grain crop. He wants compensation. This seems like a simple property dispute, but as the proceedings unfold, you realize how much cultural knowledge is embedded in its resolution. First, another man rises, someone recognized as particularly knowledgeable in traditional law. He begins reciting the relevant legal formulas from memory. These aren't brief citations. They're elaborate passages that establish the principles governing livestock damage, fence maintenance, and crop compensation. He speaks in a formal, rhythmic style that makes the legal language easier to remember and harder to dispute. This is law as oral performance, and everyone listens carefully. The children and young people present are learning several things at once. They're absorbing the specific legal principles being recited, which they may need to recall if they ever face similar disputes. They're learning the proper procedure for presenting a case and responding to accusations. They're observing how evidence is weighed, how witnesses are questioned, and how the community's elders deliberate before reaching judgment. All of this constitutes legal education, but none of it happens in what we would call a classroom. After the legal expert finishes his recitation, others are invited to confirm or challenge his memory of the traditional formulas. This public verification system was crucial in a society without written law codes. If someone misremembers or intentionally distorts a legal principle, the community's collective memory serves as a check. Several older people nod their agreement with the recitation. One adds a clarification about how these rules apply specifically during harvest season. The legal framework emerges through this collaborative process of collective remembering. Now witnesses are called. Several people saw the pigs break through the fence. Others examined the damaged crops afterward. Each tells their story, and here the educational component becomes even more evident. Young people watching learn how testimony should be delivered, clearly, without excessive emotion, sticking to observable facts rather than speculation. They see how conflicting accounts are weighed, how questions expose inconsistencies, and how truth is approached through patient inquiry rather than simply accepting the first version of events. The man whose pigs caused the damage is given the opportunity to respond. He doesn't deny the basic facts, but argues that the fence was in poor repair and that his neighbor shares responsibility for failing to maintain it properly. This introduces another layer of legal complexity, and the expert in traditional law must recite additional passages that address shared responsibility and the duties of property owners to maintain boundaries. All of this takes time. The proceedings are not rushed. Legal assembly serves not just to resolve individual disputes, but to reaffirm the community's commitment to ordered, fair resolution of conflicts. The patience displayed in these gatherings taught young people that justice couldn't be hurried, that careful consideration of facts and precedents produced better outcomes than quick judgments based on emotion or power. The deliberation phase begins. The elders confer quietly while everyone else waits. They're not just deciding this specific case, they're determining how traditional law applies to these particular circumstances and what precedent this judgment might set. Young people who will someday serve in this role watch carefully, learning how wisdom operates in practice. Finally, the judgment is announced. The pig owner must compensate his neighbor for the damaged grain, but at a reduced rate because the fence was indeed poorly maintained. Additionally, both parties must work together to properly repair the boundary between their properties before the next planting season. This is typical of Celtic legal philosophy. Punishment was less important than restoration, and obligations often ran both ways rather than falling entirely on one party. What made this educational was that young people witnessed the entire process, saw how memorized law connected to real situations, and observed respected elders applying traditional wisdom to contemporary problems. They learned that law wasn't arbitrary or abstract, but rather a living system that balanced individual rights with community welfare. Between cases, there's an interval during which a particularly accomplished legal specialist recites a lengthy passage of customary law that isn't directly related to any pending dispute. He's simply preserving and displaying important legal knowledge, giving the community's younger members exposure to principles they'll need to understand as adults. This recitation would be unbearably boring to modern audiences, but for the Celts, it was essential education and even a form of entertainment. Skilled recitation was admired as a verbal art form. The next case is more complex, a disputed inheritance. A man has died without sons, and several relatives claim rights to his property. This brings into play genealogical knowledge, marriage customs, and intricate rules about property transmission that vary depending on whether the property was originally the deceased man's own acquisition or inherited from his parents. The legal expert must recite even longer passages of traditional law, and several people contribute their memories of how similar cases were resolved in the past. Young people watching this learn that law is often complicated, that reasonable people can disagree about how rules apply to specific situations, and that resolution requires both knowledge of tradition and judgment about how to apply it fairly. They see that certain kinds of expertise, genealogical memory, knowledge of past cases, command of legal language, carry significant social authority. The afternoon wears on, and several more cases are heard. Not all are resolved immediately. Some are continued for future assemblies, pending additional testimony or consultation with legal authorities from other tribes. This teaches patience and shows that uncertainty is sometimes acceptable, that not every question has an immediately clear answer. Throughout these proceedings, no one writes anything down. The judgments, the testimony, the legal principles, all of it exists only in the memories of those present. This creates tremendous pressure on memory, but also ensures that the law remains flexible and responsive to changing circumstances. Written law becomes rigid. Oral law can adapt, while still maintaining connection to tradition. As the assembly concludes, you notice older children quizzing each other about what they heard. They're practicing recitation of legal formulas, testing each other's memory of case details, and discussing how they would have judged certain disputes. This informal peer teaching reinforced what they learned by watching the formal proceedings. Legal education happened both during the assembly and in the conversations that followed, as young people processed what they'd witnessed and debated its implications. The Celts understood that everyone needed basic legal literacy. Disputes over property, injuries, marriage contracts, and inheritances would affect almost everyone at some point. Having citizens who understood how the legal system worked, who could recite relevant principles, and who knew proper procedure, this was essential for social stability. So legal education wasn't reserved for specialists. Everyone received it year after year through attendance at assemblies where law was performed, debated, and applied to real human problems. You're back in a roundhouse, but this time the atmosphere is different. There's anticipation in the air, an almost festive quality to the gathering. Tonight features a visiting bard, someone whose skill with words and music has earned recognition beyond this single tribe's territory. The performance will be entertainment, certainly, but it's also education of a particular kind. The bard is a man of middle years, with a voice that fills the space effortlessly. He carries a lyre, a small harp with gut strings that produces a clear, bright tone when plucked. He doesn't begin immediately. He waits for the room to settle, for complete attention to gather like water pooling in a low place. When he finally speaks, it's to announce his topic. The great cattle raid that took place 2 generations ago, when the tribe's warriors recovered animals stolen by a neighboring group. This is a story everyone knows in outline, but the bard's version will be definitive, the authoritative account that people will reference and remember. What makes him a bard, rather than just a good storyteller, is his mastery of traditional poetic forms, the meters, the formulas, and the techniques that transform ordinary speech into something memorable and powerful. He begins, and immediately you notice the rhythmic quality of his words. He's speaking in a meter that Celtic audiences would recognize instantly, one reserved for heroic narrative. The rhythm itself signals the type of content and creates expectations about tone and treatment. This is a serious matter, worthy of formal poetry, and the meter announces that before any specific content does. The rhythm serves practical purposes beyond aesthetics. It makes the story easier for the bard to remember. The meter provides a framework that supports memory, each line leading naturally to the next. It also makes the story easier for listeners to remember. Humans recall rhythmic speech more readily than prose. This is why so much Celtic knowledge was encoded in poetic form. It wasn't decoration. It was functional technology for memory in an oral culture. The bard describes the discovery of the theft, the gathering of warriors, the pursuit, the confrontation, and the eventual recovery of the cattle. But he's not just recounting events. He's using traditional formulaic phrases that appear in all heroic poetry, stock descriptions of brave warriors, wise leaders, swift horses, and honorable combat. These formulas are another memory aid. They're building blocks that can be recombined in different poems, familiar units that both bard and audience recognize and anticipate. Young people listening are learning multiple things. They're absorbing historical information about an important tribal event. They're learning the values their society honors: courage, loyalty, respect for property, and willingness to fight for what belongs to you. They're hearing traditional poetic formulas that they may someday use in their own compositions. And they're experiencing how rhythm and meter transform historical record into art. The bard intersperses his narrative with songs, the lyre provides melodic support, and his voice shifts into a more musical register. These songs are even more formulaic than the narrative sections, built from standard verses that appear in many different contexts. Everyone knows the tunes. Some of the older children are already mouthing the words, joining in quietly on the familiar refrains. This participation is encouraged. Bardic performance wasn't meant to be passive entertainment consumed in silence. The audience was expected to engage, to know the traditional material well enough to appreciate both faithful adherence to formula and skillful innovation. A truly masterful bard could surprise listeners with a fresh phrase, while still maintaining the traditional framework everyone expected. Between major sections of his performance, the bard pauses to drink and rest his voice. During these intervals, people discuss what they've heard, point out particularly effective phrases, and note where this version differs from other versions they've encountered. This is literary criticism happening in real time, and young people absorb standards for what makes good poetry. An older boy, maybe 15, is asked by one of the adults to recite a portion of what he's just heard. He stands nervously and begins, trying to capture both the words and the rhythmic pattern. He stumbles, loses the meter, and has to stop and start again. No one mocks him. This is difficult, and everyone knows it. The bard himself offers encouragement, suggests he listen to the meter first before worrying about the words, and then helps him find the rhythm by tapping it out on the wooden floor. This is how bardic skill was taught, through exposure, imitation, practice, and gentle correction. Those who showed aptitude for memorization and performance might pursue specialized training, but everyone was expected to develop at least basic competence in traditional poetic forms. You needed these skills to participate fully in cultural life, to contribute to gatherings, and to preserve and transmit the stories that defined your community. The bard resumes his performance, moving into the final section where the warriors return home triumphant. The stolen cattle are redistributed to their rightful owners, and proper order is restored. He describes the feast that followed, and even in this description, he's encoding cultural information about proper hospitality, about how status determines seating arrangements, and about what constitutes appropriate celebration after conflict. As the evening progresses, others are invited to contribute. An old woman recites a poem about the same cattle raid, but from a different perspective. She focuses on the women who waited at home, uncertain whether their husbands and sons would return. Her version uses a different meter, one associated with lament and longing. It's equally traditional, equally formulaic, but it creates an entirely different emotional effect. This demonstrates something important about Celtic poetic education. There wasn't a single correct version of any story. Different perspectives, different emphases, and different emotional tones were all acceptable, as long as they adhered to traditional forms and didn't violate fundamental facts. This flexibility within structure characterized much of Celtic oral culture. A younger bard, still in training, offers his own composition, a new poem about a recent event, structured in one of the traditional meters. It's ambitious to perform original work in front of an accomplished master, and you can see the young man's nervousness. But his composition is solid. He's clearly learned the rules and internalized the formulas, and he's applying them creatively to new material. The visiting bard nods approvingly, and afterward offers specific praise for particularly skillful passages. This encouragement of composition was crucial to the system's survival. Celtic poetry couldn't remain static. New events needed to be incorporated, new heroes celebrated, and new lessons encoded in memorable form. Young poets learned traditional formulas not just to preserve old material, but to create new material that would itself become traditional for future generations. As the gathering finally begins to break up late in the evening, people are still reciting verses to each other, testing their memories, and debating fine points of meter and word choice. The educational aspect of the bardic performance continues even after the formal performance ends. Conversations will carry these poems through the next days and weeks, reinforcing memory, spreading the bard's version of events, and keeping the poetic tradition alive and active. Young people departing into the night have had their memories stocked with new material. They've heard traditional formulas in action, witnessed skillful performance, and tried their own hands at recitation. Some of them will forget most of this within days. Others will remember it for decades. And a few, those with real aptitude and passion for the bardic arts, will devote years to mastering the craft they glimpsed tonight. The bard himself will travel on to the next tribe, carrying his repertoire of poems and his technique across the landscape, serving as a living conduit of culture. His knowledge isn't written anywhere. It exists in his memory, in his voice, and in his hands on the lyre strings. When he dies, what he hasn't passed on to students will die with him. This fragility gives bardic performance an urgency and importance that's hard for literate cultures to fully grasp. The bard isn't just entertaining. He's preserving civilization itself, one poem at a time. You're observing a small group of adults now, all past what the Celts would consider youth. The youngest is perhaps 30, the oldest nearing 60. They're gathered around someone even older, a woman whose knowledge of herbal medicine is recognized throughout this region and beyond. What's striking is that these aren't novices beginning their education. They're experienced practitioners who have come to learn more. Celtic education didn't end with youth. The concept of finishing your education and then simply applying what you'd learned for the rest of your life would have seemed strange, even impossible, to these people. Knowledge was understood to be vast, deeper than any individual could fully master. There was always more to learn, always someone more knowledgeable to learn from, and always room for refinement and growth. The old herbalist is teaching them about a plant most of them already know. They've used it for years in their own healing work. But she's sharing subtleties, how the plant's potency varies depending on exactly when in its growth cycle you harvest it, how combining it with other herbs creates effects different from using it alone, and how preparing it differently changes which properties become most active. This is advanced knowledge, the kind that only comes from decades of careful observation and experimentation. The students ask questions freely. There's no hierarchy here based on age or status, only the acknowledged expertise of the teacher and the genuine curiosity of those who want to deepen their understanding. One woman describes a case where this plant didn't work as expected, and instead of dismissing the concern, the herbalist asks detailed questions about every aspect of how it was prepared and administered. Together they work through what might have gone wrong, and everyone benefits from analyzing the failure. This collaborative approach to learning characterized adult Celtic education. Younger students were expected to memorize and absorb without much questioning, but mature learners engaged more actively, bringing their own experience to bear, testing traditional knowledge against practical outcomes, and contributing to the collective understanding even as they learned from those more expert. The herbalist moves on to demonstrate a preparation technique that requires precise timing and specific conditions. She's not just describing it, she's actually doing it, and the students watch with intense focus. They've probably seen similar demonstrations before, but they're watching again because mastery comes through repeated observation and practice. No one assumes that seeing something once is sufficient to truly learn it. What's interesting is the diversity of expertise represented among the students. One is known for skill in treating injuries, broken bones, wounds, and burns. Another specializes in children's ailments. A third has developed particular knowledge about conditions affecting the elderly. They've each taken different paths through the vast terrain of healing knowledge, specializing based on interest, opportunity, and the needs of their communities. But they still come together to learn from someone whose knowledge spans more territory than any of them have yet covered. Later in the day, the focus shifts to a different kind of adult learning. A group of men gather to discuss legal matters with someone recognized as particularly knowledgeable about traditional law. Several of them serve as judges in their own communities, but they're here to deepen their understanding of complex legal principles and hear how their mentor would approach difficult cases. This isn't passive listening. They describe actual cases they've faced, and the legal expert works through them systematically, explaining which traditional principles apply, how those principles might be interpreted, and what precedents exist. The other judges argue with him, point out complications he might not have considered, and bring up local customs that modify the general rules. This is legal education as active dialogue between experienced practitioners. The conversation reveals something important about Celtic knowledge systems. They were both conservative and dynamic at the same time. The foundation was ancient tradition, legal principles, medical knowledge, and agricultural practices passed down through generations. But application required judgment, adaptation to specific circumstances, and willingness to acknowledge that traditional wisdom sometimes needed to be modified based on new situations or accumulated experience. An older farmer has come to learn from a specialist in animal husbandry, someone whose cattle are consistently healthier and more productive than average. The specialist shares observations about feeding practices, breeding selection, and disease prevention. Much of this the farmer already knows, but some details are new, and even the familiar information gains new layers of meaning when explained by someone who has thought about it more deeply. The specialist mentions an innovation, a slight modification to traditional practice that he's been testing for several years with good results. This is risky. Suggesting that the old ways might be improved could be seen as arrogance or disrespect for tradition. But he frames it carefully, explaining how his change actually better serves the underlying principles that the traditional practice was meant to honor. The farmer considers this seriously, asks questions, and eventually decides to try it with a portion of his own herd while maintaining traditional practices with the rest. This is how innovation could occur within a conservative framework. Cautiously, experimentally, and always in conversation with tradition, rather than in opposition to it. Throughout the day, you observe many such learning exchanges. A weaver comes to learn more complex patterns from a master. A metal worker studies with someone whose bronze work is exceptionally fine. A woman known for skill in preparing skins seeks advice about treating a particularly difficult hide. All of these are adults continuing their education, deepening expertise they already possess, and remaining open to new knowledge throughout their lives. This expectation of lifelong learning served several purposes. Practically, it meant that the community's collective knowledge continued to grow and refine across generations. Each generation inherited traditional wisdom, but also added their own observations, innovations, and accumulated experience. Socially, it created opportunities for people of different ages to interact around shared interests, breaking down barriers that might otherwise develop between generations. Perhaps most importantly, it meant that expertise was recognized and valued. Those who had devoted years to mastering a particular domain of knowledge were sought out, respected, and given opportunities to teach. This created incentives for people to develop deep knowledge rather than settling for superficial competence. As evening approaches, various groups conclude their learning sessions, but the education doesn't stop. Over meals, people continue discussions that began during formal teaching. Questions are asked, stories shared, and techniques debated. Someone pulls out a piece they've been working on, a textile, a tool, a poem, and asks for feedback. Others examine it critically, noting what works well and suggesting where it might be improved. This informal continuing education permeated daily life. You didn't stop learning when you finished your apprenticeship or mastered your craft. There was always someone more knowledgeable to learn from, always room for refinement, and always new challenges that required extending your capabilities. The old herbalist, finishing her teaching day, is herself learning. Someone has brought her a plant from distant territory, something she hasn't encountered before. She examines it carefully and asks questions about where it grows and how it's used by those who know it. Tomorrow, she'll experiment with it, test its properties, and determine whether it might have applications in her own practice. She's past 70 years old, and she's still expanding her knowledge, still curious, still eager to learn. This is the ideal that Celtic education promoted, not that you would finish learning at some point, but that you would remain a student of life itself until death ended the opportunity. Knowledge was infinite, mastery was always partial, and there was honor in acknowledging how much you didn't yet know. The wisest people were often those most aware of the vastness of what remained beyond their grasp. You're witnessing something that previous generations of Celts never experienced. A young man carefully inscribing marks onto a smooth wooden board using ink made from oak galls. This is writing, and its arrival in Celtic lands represents the beginning of a profound transformation in how knowledge is preserved and transmitted. The year is roughly 50 BCE, and Roman influence has been creeping northward for decades. With it comes literacy, the practice of recording speech as permanent visual marks that can be read later by anyone who knows the code. Some Celtic communities are beginning to adopt this technology, though often reluctantly and with clear awareness that something important might be lost in the transition. The young man is learning Latin letters, but he's using them to write Celtic words, the names of his ancestors, a legal formula he wants to preserve exactly, and a prayer to a local deity. This hybrid practice was common in the early days of Celtic literacy. The technology was borrowed, but the content remained distinctively Celtic. His teacher, a man who learned writing from Roman traders, watches with mixed feelings. On one hand, writing offers obvious advantages. You can preserve information precisely, without worry that memory might corrupt it over time. You can communicate over distance without requiring messengers to memorize elaborate messages. You can create records that survive beyond any individual's lifespan. But there are costs too. Costs that traditional druids were quick to identify when writing first appeared. Most obvious is the effect on memory. When you can write something down, the pressure to remember it diminishes. The young man laboriously recording his genealogy isn't simultaneously committing it to memory the way he would if recitation were the only means of preservation. The written record becomes a substitute for memory rather than a support for it. There's also the question of access. Not everyone can learn to read and write, especially in these early days when literacy is a specialized skill requiring years of training. This means that recorded knowledge becomes the province of an educated elite in a way that oral knowledge never was. Anyone with a good memory could participate in oral culture, but reading and writing create new divisions between those who possess these skills and those who don't. The druids opposed writing, especially for sacred knowledge, but their opposition wasn't simple technophobia. They understood that the medium shapes the message in subtle but important ways. Oral tradition is flexible, allowing each generation to adjust emphasis and details while maintaining core meaning. Written texts are fixed, resistant to change, and claiming a kind of absolute authority that oral tradition never possessed. The young man has finished writing the genealogy. His teacher reads it back to him, checking accuracy. There's an irony here. The written record must be verified against the oral tradition it's meant to preserve. But once it's verified and accepted as accurate, this wooden board becomes the authority. Future disputes about lineage might be settled by consulting the writing, rather than by calling on human memory and collective recollection. Over the next generation, this pattern repeats across Celtic lands, where Roman influence is strong. More young people learn to read and write. More knowledge gets recorded. Gradually, written records begin to replace oral tradition as the primary means of preserving important information. But the transformation is neither complete nor uniform. In areas where Roman influence is weak or absent, oral tradition continues unchanged. Even in more Romanized regions, certain kinds of knowledge remain exclusively oral. The druids still refuse to record their most sacred teachings, insisting that some wisdom can only be properly transmitted from living teacher to living student, mind to mind, voice to ear. An old druid visits the young man who's been learning to write. This druid has devoted 40 years to memorizing the enormous corpus of knowledge his order preserves. He carries in his mind poetry, law, history, astronomy, medicine, and religious teaching that would fill many large books if it were ever written down. He could recite for days without repeating himself. He looks at the young man's wooden board with its carefully inscribed genealogy. "This is the death of memory," he says quietly. Not angry, just sad. He understands what's being lost, even if he can't prevent it. When knowledge lives only in writing, the mental discipline required for oral tradition atrophies. The elaborate memory techniques developed over centuries become unnecessary. The intimate connection between knower and knowledge weakens when texts become the intermediary. But the young man sees different possibilities. Writing means knowledge can spread more widely, can be consulted by people who never met the original teacher, and can survive wars and disasters that might kill those who carry oral tradition. He's not wrong about these advantages, and the druid knows it. The old man isn't arguing that writing has no value, only that its adoption carries costs that are often overlooked in enthusiasm for its benefits. Over the following weeks, you observe both systems operating side by side. In one gathering, people recite traditional poetry from memory, maintaining oral tradition exactly as it has been maintained for centuries. In another gathering, someone reads a letter that has arrived from a neighboring tribe, and the ability to communicate precisely over distance through written words is clearly valuable. Celtic culture is caught between two modes of knowledge preservation, benefiting from both, but unable to maintain both indefinitely. The transition happens gradually but inexorably. Children, who once would have devoted years to memorizing tribal history and lore, now spend that time learning to read and write instead. The balance shifts from memory to text as the primary repository of cultural knowledge. By the time Roman occupation becomes complete in some areas, the transformation is largely finished. Celtic oral tradition survives only in the memories of the oldest generation, and when they die, much of it dies with them. What survived in writing was selective. Laws and genealogies were recorded because they had practical importance. Some stories and poems were written down by monks interested in preserving Celtic heritage, but the vast body of knowledge that druids carried, including much of their natural philosophy, their astronomical observations, and their medical understanding, was never written and therefore was lost. This wasn't entirely the fault of writing itself. Roman conquest and later Christian conversion disrupted Celtic society in ways that would have damaged oral tradition regardless. But literacy accelerated the transformation, making it easier for Celtic culture to be absorbed into the Roman world, translated into Latin categories, and preserved in forms that owed more to Mediterranean civilization than to Celtic roots. The young man continues practicing his writing. He's proud of this new skill and excited about the possibilities it opens. He doesn't fully grasp what his society is losing, even as it gains the advantages of literacy. Perhaps no one who lives through such a transition can fully understand it while it's happening. But the old druid understands. He sees the long arc of history and recognizes that the educational system that shaped him is ending. The patient cultivation of memory, the elaborate oral traditions, and the direct transmission of knowledge from teacher to student over decades, all of this is giving way to a different model. Not necessarily a worse one, but fundamentally different, carrying different strengths and limitations. As twilight deepens, the druid begins reciting a long poem that he learned as a young man, just as his teacher learned it, just as countless generations learned it before him. The young man with his writing board tries to capture the words as marks on wood, but he can't write fast enough. The poem flows past him, rich and complex, full of linguistic subtleties that resist reduction to written form. He captures fragments, but the living performance, the rhythm, the emphasis, the slight variations from previous performances, the emotional resonance in the druid's voice, these escape his written record entirely. This moment captures the transition perfectly. The old way and the new way exist simultaneously, neither yet dominant, both offering value. But the direction of change is clear. Within a few generations, Celtic education will look very different, will rely on texts rather than memory, and will transmit knowledge through reading rather than recitation. Something ancient and sophisticated will have been lost, even as new possibilities emerge. You're sitting alone now, in the early morning quiet, thinking about everything you've observed. The education system of the ancient Celts, for all its strangeness to modern sensibilities, accomplished something remarkable. It transmitted complex knowledge across generations without schools, textbooks, or written records. How did it work? And what does it reveal about human learning more generally? First, it demonstrates that formal schooling isn't the only way to educate. The Celts taught their children effectively without buildings dedicated to education, without professional teachers making it their sole occupation, and without age-segregated classrooms. Learning happened in natural contexts, integrated with daily life, emerging from real needs and genuine relationships between older and younger people. This approach had advantages. Children learned in environments where knowledge had immediate application and obvious value. They could see adults using the skills they were being taught, and could understand why memorizing plant properties or legal formulas mattered. This contrasts sharply with modern schooling, where children often learn abstract material with no clear connection to their current lives, on faith that it will somehow prove useful in a distant future. The Celtic system also avoided the artificial separation between learning and doing. You didn't spend years in school being prepared for life. You learned through living, through participating in activities that mattered to your community. A child learning to identify medicinal plants wasn't doing homework. She was acquiring knowledge that might save her mother's life during the next illness. This gave learning urgency and meaning that purely academic study sometimes lacks. But the system also had serious limitations that become apparent from this distance. Most obviously, it couldn't preserve knowledge through major disruptions. When Roman conquest devastated Celtic society, when druids were killed or forbidden to practice, and when oral tradition was interrupted by violence or cultural suppression, enormous amounts of knowledge vanished forever. Written records, for all their limitations, survive conquest and persecution better than memory does. The system was also conservative in ways that limited innovation. When knowledge exists only in memory, there's strong pressure to preserve it exactly as received. Experimentation is risky, because if innovations prove unsuccessful, you might lose the traditional knowledge you were attempting to improve. Written records make innovations safer by preserving the original alongside attempts at modification. Access to education was determined largely by birth. If you were born into a family with high status and resources, you had opportunities for extensive learning that children from poorer families couldn't access. While the system allowed for some social mobility based on demonstrated ability, it was fundamentally hierarchical in ways that modern egalitarian societies find troubling. The system's genius lay in its sophisticated understanding of memory. The Celts developed techniques for organizing, encoding, and retrieving information that modern memory researchers are only beginning to fully appreciate. They understood that rhythm aids memory, that spatial associations make recall easier, that stories stick better than abstract facts, and that repeated exposure over time creates lasting retention. They also understood that memory is social. Knowledge preserved by a community is more reliable than knowledge held by individuals. When 50 people have memorized the same legal formula, the chance of significant corruption is small. When recitation happens publicly, errors can be caught and corrected. Collective memory has redundancy and error checking built in. This social dimension of Celtic education is perhaps its most important lesson for modern times. Learning wasn't something that happened in isolation, with individual students competing against each other for grades. It was collaborative, intergenerational, and fundamentally communal. You learned with your peers and from your elders, you contributed to collective knowledge, and you took responsibility for preserving and transmitting culture to the next generation. The emphasis on oral tradition reveals something deeper about human cognition. For most of human history, knowledge existed in minds and voices, not in external storage systems. This meant that education had to work with natural human cognitive capacities, our ability to remember stories, our sensitivity to rhythm and pattern, our capacity for spatial memory, and associative thinking. Celtic education was sophisticated because it had to be, because it couldn't rely on technological supports for memory. When writing emerged, education could become less sophisticated in certain ways because external storage compensated for individual memory limitations. Students no longer needed to develop the powerful memory techniques that Celtic education cultivated. This was simultaneously a loss and a gain, a loss of certain cognitive capacities, but a gain in the amount of knowledge that could be preserved and accessed. The Celtic approach to lifelong learning challenges modern assumptions about education as something that happens primarily in youth. For the Celts, learning was a permanent condition of being human. You never outgrew the need for new knowledge, never finished developing your expertise, and never stopped being a student. The wisest elders were still learning from each other and from younger people who had observed things they'd missed. This perpetual studenthood wasn't burdensome, it was ennobling. It meant that you remained intellectually alive, engaged with the world, and contributing to collective knowledge throughout your life. It created communities where expertise was genuinely valued, and where those who developed deep knowledge in any domain could expect respect and opportunities to share what they'd learned. The emphasis on listening, truly attentive listening, is perhaps the most countercultural aspect of Celtic education for modern people. We live in times of constant distraction, where sustained attention is increasingly rare and difficult. Celtic children were trained from an early age to listen carefully for extended periods, to remember what they heard, and to distinguish between subtle variations in sound and meaning. This capacity for sustained attention was the foundation of everything else they learned. As morning light strengthens and you emerge from this reflection, you recognize that Celtic education, for all its differences from modern practice, was responding to universal human needs. The need to preserve knowledge across generations, to prepare young people for adult life, and to maintain cultural continuity while allowing for adaptation to changing circumstances. The specific methods were products of their time and place, but the underlying challenges remain constant. You're back in that original clearing as evening settles, years after you first arrived. The children you initially observed have grown. Some have become parents themselves, bringing their own young ones to learn. The woman who taught plant knowledge has passed away, but her knowledge lives on in those she taught, who now teach others. This is the Celtic educational system in its fullest expression, an endless chain of transmission, each generation learning and teaching, preserving and innovating, maintaining continuity while adapting to new circumstances. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, sits beneath the ancient oak as twilight deepens. She's listening to an older woman, her aunt actually, describe the stars that are beginning to appear overhead. The woman points to specific constellations, tells the stories associated with them, and explains how they move through the seasons and what those movements mean for planting and harvest. The girl asks a question about why the stars move. The woman considers carefully before answering. She shares what traditional knowledge teaches about celestial motion, but she also admits that there's mystery here, aspects of the natural world that even the wisest druids don't fully understand. This honesty about the limits of knowledge is itself an important lesson. As full darkness arrives, the woman stops teaching astronomy and begins a story. It's one the girl has heard before, but she settles in to hear it again, knowing that each telling reveals something new, some detail she missed previously, or some significance she's now old enough to understand. The story is about a hero's journey, as so many Celtic stories were, but embedded in its narrative are lessons about courage, about loyalty to community, about wisdom and humility, and about the proper relationship between humans and the natural world. The girl absorbs these lessons without conscious effort, without anyone announcing, "Now we're learning ethics." The values simply arrive through the story, settling into her understanding like sediment slowly accumulating on a riverbed. Other people have gathered quietly, a few parents with younger children and some older students hoping to hear advanced teachings after the children sleep. This multi-generational gathering is typical of Celtic education. There were no rigid age divisions, no sense that people of different generations should learn separately. Knowledge flowed across generational boundaries in all directions. The woman finishes her story just as the youngest child is nodding off, Parents carry sleeping children home, and the gathering shifts. Now an older man begins teaching, his voice quiet but clear in the darkness. He's sharing knowledge meant for more mature students, complex legal principles, detailed astronomical observations, and sophisticated agricultural techniques. But he teaches in the same gentle, patient way that characterized instruction for children. This quality of patience was fundamental to Celtic education. There was no rushing, no pressure to achieve certain knowledge by certain ages, no anxiety about falling behind arbitrary standards. Learning unfolded at its own pace, determined by the student's capacity and the teacher's availability. Some learned quickly, others slowly. Some developed deep expertise in narrow domains, others acquired broad but shallower knowledge across many areas. All of this was acceptable because the system was flexible enough to accommodate different abilities and interests. The night deepens, stars wheel slowly overhead, tracking patterns that these people have observed and memorized over countless generations. The man is explaining how to predict the optimal time for planting based on lunar cycles and stellar positions. This is practical knowledge, but it's also poetry, the observation of pattern, the recognition of order within natural chaos, and the human impulse to understand and work with, rather than against the rhythms of the world. Eventually, even this teaching ends. The gathering disperses quietly. People walk home through darkness, navigating familiar paths without need for light. They've learned these routes so thoroughly through repeated travel that their feet know the way. This too is education, the accumulated knowledge of landscape, the deep familiarity with place that comes from living somewhere long enough to internalize its geography. You remain in the clearing after everyone else has gone, sitting in the darkness beneath the oak. The tree has stood here for centuries, and will stand for centuries more if left undisturbed. It has witnessed countless gatherings, like tonight's, and has shaded countless students learning the knowledge their culture values. It's a living monument to continuity, to the patient accumulation of growth over time. This patience is perhaps the final and most important lesson of Celtic education. Knowledge doesn't arrive in a rush. Understanding deepens gradually. Wisdom emerges from long experience and careful observation. There are no shortcuts, no techniques for rapid mastery. There is only the patient work of learning, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. As you sit in the darkness, you understand that Celtic education succeeded not because of superior techniques or exceptional teachers, but because it was woven into the fabric of daily life. Learning happened naturally because knowledge had obvious value, because respected elders shared it freely, and because young people could see the direct connection between what they learned and how they would live. The stars continue their slow wheel overhead, following patterns the Celts observed but never fully explained. The wind moves through oak leaves, making the same soft sound it has made for millennia. The clearing remains, a space made sacred not by ritual, but by centuries of learning, by the countless students who sat here and listened, remembered, and understood. This is where we leave the Celtic education system, in a quiet clearing under ancient oaks, with knowledge passing from one generation to the next, in the oldest way humans have ever learned, through patient listening, careful observation, and the timeless relationship between those who know and those who want to know. The system itself is long gone, swept away by conquest, conversion, and the inexorable spread of writing. But something of its spirit survives in every moment when a young person listens carefully to an older one, when knowledge passes through voice rather than text, when learning happens through relationship rather than institution. As you prepare to let sleep come, perhaps you carry with you some sense of what was lost when education moved from clearings into classrooms, from memory into books, and from living relationships into standardized curriculum. But perhaps also you recognize what was gained, access for more people, preservation across disruptions, and accumulation of knowledge beyond what any human memory could hold. Both systems serve human needs. Both have strengths and limitations. The Celtic way reminds us that formal schooling isn't the only path to education, that learning can be gentler and more integrated with life, that memory and attention are capacities worth cultivating. But it also shows us why writing mattered, why recording knowledge brought irreplaceable benefits, and why literacy opened possibilities that oral tradition alone could never achieve. The oak tree in the clearing remains, neutral between past and present, holding space for learning regardless of method. And beneath it, across centuries, the basic transaction of education continues. One person sharing what they know with someone who wants to learn, knowledge flowing across the boundary between generations, and culture perpetuating itself through the simple but profound act of teaching. This is how the Celts educated their children, without walls, without books, without tests or grades. And in doing so, they demonstrated that education is ultimately about human connection, about the willingness to preserve and transmit what previous generations learned, and about the patient cultivation of understanding over time. As the night deepens and sleep approaches, you can rest knowing that this ancient system, for all its strangeness to modern minds, successfully transmitted complex knowledge across hundreds of generations. Their methods may have vanished, but their fundamental insight remains. Education is how we become fully human, how we connect to our past, and how we prepare for our future. And that lesson requires no writing to preserve it, only the continued presence of those willing to teach and those willing to learn. Welcome to a journey through mist and memory, where we'll walk together through the world of the Celts, a people who never built empires or conquered distant lands, yet shaped the very soul of Europe. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 800 BCE to the time of Christ, Celtic communities spread across the continent like wildflowers, each one distinct but connected by language, art, and a way of seeing the world that still whispers to us today. Let's settle in and travel back to a time before borders, before nations, to discover the gentle civilization that lived in rhythm with the land itself. You're standing in a clearing somewhere in Central Europe, and the year is around 800 BCE, though of course nobody's counting yet. The morning fog sits heavy between the oak trees, thick enough that you could almost believe it has weight. Somewhere in that fog, a cow lows softly, and you hear the distant clank of a bronze pot against stone. This is how the Celtic world begins. Not with a bang, not with armies marching, but with smoke rising from roundhouses and the smell of barley porridge cooking over fires that have been tended since before anyone can remember. The people here don't call themselves Celts, of course. That's a name the Greeks will give them much later, probably because they heard the word Keltoi somewhere and thought it sounded appropriately exotic. The people in this clearing would tell you they're simply the folk who live by the river bend, or near the old hill, or in the valley where the good clay comes from. What makes them Celtic, though nobody's putting it into words yet, is the way they've been doing things for generations. The language they speak rolls and lilts in a particular way. Their bronze smiths have been passing down techniques for making tools and jewelry that carry distinctive patterns, spirals and curves that seem to flow like water. When they bury their dead, they place certain objects in the graves, a favorite cup perhaps, or a beautifully made pin to fasten a cloak. Let's walk through this village with you. The houses are round, their walls made of woven hazel branches packed with clay and dung, which sounds unpleasant until you realize it's actually excellent insulation and smells mostly of earth and dried grass. The roofs are thick thatch, steep enough that rain runs right off. Inside, there's a central hearth that never quite goes out, even in summer, because starting a fire from scratch is tiresome work involving a bow drill and a lot of patience. The floor is packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes that get replaced when they start to smell. Smoke finds its way out through the thatch, mostly, though the interior of these homes always carries a pleasant wood smoke smell that gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your dreams. There's something deeply comforting about it. That scent feels as if safety itself has an odor. The family who lives here, let's say 5 or 6 people, maybe 3 generations, don't have much by modern standards, but what they have is well made. There's a loom in the corner where someone's been weaving wool into cloth with a checked pattern. The wool has been dyed with plants from the surrounding countryside, yellow from lady's bedstraw, blue from woad, and red from madder root. The resulting fabric is soft and warm and will last for years. Against one wall, there's a shelf with pottery bowls, some plain and practical, others decorated with simple geometric patterns. There are bronze pins for fastening clothes, maybe a few amber beads from the distant Baltic coast, and evidence of trade networks that stretch farther than you might think. In a leather bag hang herbs for cooking and healing. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulated wisdom of generations, about which leaves help with stomach troubles, and which ones make the stew taste better. Outside, the village spreads in a loose cluster of similar roundhouses, maybe 20 or 30 of them. There are no straight streets, no city planning, just houses built where it seemed good to build them, near each other for company and safety, but not so close you can hear your neighbor's every conversation. Between the houses, children are playing a game that involves throwing stones at a mark drawn in the dirt, and they're arguing about the rules in that timeless way children have argued about rules since the invention of games. The fields beyond the village are small and irregular, following the contours of the land rather than imposing order on it. People here grow emmer wheat and barley, tend small gardens with peas and beans, gather hazelnuts from the woods, and keep pigs that forage in the forest. Cattle are wealth here. The more cows you have, the more important you are. But they're also deeply practical, giving milk, pulling ploughs, and eventually providing meat and leather. What you notice most, though, is the pace of things. Nobody's rushing. The smith works at his anvil with patient, practiced movements. The woman carding wool does so while chatting with her neighbor. 2 men repairing a section of fence stop regularly to discuss the best way to do it, disagree amicably, try it one way, then shrug and try it another. There's time for everything, because time itself feels different when the sun and seasons are your only clocks. The Celts are emerging here in Central Europe, not because they invaded or conquered, but because groups of people sharing similar languages and customs have been living, farming and trading together for so long that they've become a recognizable cultural family. They're not a unified nation. That concept doesn't exist yet. They're more like cousins who live in different valleys, but recognize each other's accents and appreciate each other's pottery styles. Now we're moving forward a couple of centuries to around 600 BCE, and something important has shifted. You're in the same general region. Let's say what will one day be Austria, but the village has grown, and more importantly, it's working with a new material, iron. The discovery that certain stones, when heated in a very hot fire with charcoal, produce a tough metal that holds an edge better than bronze. This changes things. Not overnight, of course. Change is almost never overnight, despite what the history books sometimes suggest. But gradually, iron tools appear, plows that can break tougher soil, axes that can clear forests more efficiently, and swords and spearheads that are cheaper to make than bronze ones. You're watching a smith work, and there's something almost meditative about it. The iron has been heating in the forge for a while now, brought to a temperature where it glows orange-red. The smith pulls it out with tongs and begins to hammer, and each strike of the hammer is deliberate and purposeful. Sparks fly, which would be exciting except the smith barely notices them anymore. This is his daily work, this transformation of earth into tool. The thing about iron is that it's more common than the copper and tin needed for bronze. This means more people can have metal tools, which means more forest can be cleared, more land can be farmed, and more food can be grown. And more food means more people, which means bigger settlements, which means more organization is needed, which means some people start to become more important than others. This is how you get the rise of Celtic aristocrats, not through conquest or inheritance of divine right, but through the gradual accumulation of cattle, land, and the ability to host better feasts than your neighbors. In Celtic society, generosity is prestige. The person who can afford to throw a party where everyone eats meat and drinks imported wine, yes, they're already trading with Mediterranean peoples for wine, that person earns status and loyalty. Let's visit one of these aristocratic settlements, a hill fort that's been growing for generations. It sits on a prominent hill, naturally defensive, surrounded by ditches and ramparts made of earth and timber. Inside, there are still the familiar roundhouses, but some are larger than others, and the buildings are more densely packed. There's a communal area where people gather for festivals and markets, and the settlement of disputes. The chief's house is noticeably bigger, with more elaborate decorations. The doorposts are carved with spiraling patterns that seem to move in the firelight. Inside, the walls are hung with shields and weapons that are as much art as armament. Bronze shields with raised decorative bosses, swords with hilts wrapped in gold wire, and spearheads with intricate inlay work. But here's what's interesting. The chief isn't a king in the later European sense. He can't just order people around. His power comes from his ability to keep people happy, to mediate disputes fairly, to be generous with his wealth, and to throw those famous feasts. If he becomes tyrannical or stingy, people can simply leave and attach themselves to another chief. It's a surprisingly fluid system. The feasts are legendary, lasting days sometimes. Picture enormous cauldrons bubbling with beef stew, spit roasted pork, bread made from wheat that's been ground by hand, and honey mead in quantities that would make a modern person worried about everyone's liver. Musicians play harps and pipes. Poets recite long genealogies and stories of ancient heroes. People talk, laugh, argue, and occasionally fight, though fights at feasts are considered bad form and might get you banned from future gatherings. Celtic society at this point is organized into tribes, each with its own territory, and these tribes are further divided into extended family groups. Your identity is defined by your relationships, whose child you are, whose cousin, and whose client. There's a whole vocabulary for different kinds of relationships and obligations. If someone wrongs you, your entire extended family is obligated to help you seek compensation. If you wrong someone, your family helps pay the fine. This might sound restrictive, but it also means nobody faces the world alone. You're always embedded in a web of relationships, for better or worse. It's the opposite of the modern feeling of being an isolated individual, something that would seem utterly alien and rather sad to a Celt. The landscape is changing too. More forest is being cleared, more fields planted. But the Celts aren't trying to dominate nature, they're negotiating with it. Sacred groves remain untouched. Certain springs are holy. Some trees are so old and venerable that cutting them would be unthinkable. The land is full of spirits and gods, most of whom don't have temples or statues, but live in the rivers, mountains, and ancient oaks. By around 400 BCE, Celtic peoples are everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but spread across a remarkably large area, from Ireland in the west to what is now Turkey in the east, from southern Germany down through France and into Spain. This isn't because of some massive military campaign or organized migration. It's more like a slow diffusion, families and clans moving over generations, sometimes pushed by population pressure, sometimes pulled by the promise of better land or trading opportunities. You're traveling now, which in Celtic times means walking mostly. If you're lucky and wealthy, you might ride a horse or drive a cart, but most people experience Europe at walking pace, about 3 miles an hour, maybe 20 miles in a day if you're really pushing it. At this speed, you notice things. The way the light changes as you move from oak forest to open meadow, the sound of different rivers, the smell of the air in different regions. Let's say you start in what will become France. The Celts here will eventually be called Gauls by the Romans. The landscape is a patchwork of farmland and forest, with villages and hill forts scattered across the countryside. The people speak a Celtic language that your ancestors would have recognized, though the accent is different, and some of the words have shifted. You're welcomed in a village because that's what you do. You welcome travelers. They're sources of news, entertainment, and trade goods. You're given food and a place to sleep, and in return, you share stories about where you've come from. This is how news travels in a world without writing or telecommunications, from mouth to mouth, village to village, slowly percolating across the continent. Moving eastward, you pass through regions where Celtic tribes have settled among other peoples, sometimes displacing them, sometimes intermarrying, and usually just living alongside them. The Celtic characteristic isn't racial or ethnic, it's linguistic and cultural. If you speak a Celtic language and follow Celtic customs, you're Celtic, regardless of who your grandparents were. In the Alps, you find Celts who have adapted to mountain life, building their villages on terraces, keeping goats and sheep more than cattle, and becoming experts at mountain passes that will still be used 2,000 years later. The mountain Celts have a reputation for being particularly tough and independent, which seems to be a universal characteristic of mountain people everywhere and always. Descending into the Po Valley in northern Italy, you encounter Celts who have settled in an area with a warmer climate than their ancestors knew. They've adopted Mediterranean crops, grapes and olives, while maintaining their Celtic identity. Some of them have started writing, using alphabets borrowed from the Etruscans and Greeks, though writing is still mostly for important inscriptions and accounting. The real knowledge, the stuff that matters, is still carried in people's heads and passed down orally. Further east, you reach Celtic settlements in what will become Romania and Bulgaria. These Celts have been here for generations now, and they've picked up influences from their neighbors, Thracians, Greeks, and eventually Dacians. Their art shows it, blending Celtic curves and spirals with local motifs. But they still speak a Celtic language and still organize their society in familiar ways. And then, remarkably, you reach Celtic communities that have settled in Asia Minor, in what is now central Turkey. These are the Galatians, who arrived here as mercenaries and warriors, but who have settled down to become farmers and craftspeople, like their Western cousins. They're surrounded by very different cultures, Greek cities, Persian influences, but they maintain their identity for centuries. What strikes you on this journey is both the diversity and the similarity. Each Celtic community has adapted to its local environment and neighbors, but everywhere you observe the same basic cultural patterns: the importance of cattle, the round houses, the spiral art, the elaborate metalwork, the bardic tradition of poets and storytellers, and the complex web of family and tribal obligations. You also notice what's missing. There are no Celtic capitals, no central government, and no empire. The Celts never developed the kind of political organization that the Romans or Greeks did. They remained a collection of tribes, sometimes allied, sometimes fighting among themselves, but never unified. This will eventually prove disastrous when faced with Roman military organization. But for now, in 400 BCE, it seems to be working fine. Why would you need a vast bureaucratic state when you have your tribe, your family, your chief, and your community? Let's slow down and spend some time in a Celtic household, because daily life is where culture really lives. Not in battles or politics, but in how people spend their ordinary hours. You wake before dawn in a roundhouse, somewhere in Gaul. The fire in the central hearth has burned down to embers, giving off just enough warmth to take the chill off the morning air. Someone, probably whoever drew the short straw, metaphorically speaking, gets up to feed the fire, adding wood and blowing on the embers until flames catch. The smoke begins its lazy rise to the thatched roof. Breakfast is simple. Leftover bread from yesterday, maybe some cheese, and definitely milk if the cow has been milked yet. There might be porridge made from barley or oats, filling and warm. People eat with their fingers and wooden spoons. Forks haven't been invented yet, but honestly, who needs them? The day's work depends on the season. Let's say it's spring, so there's ploughing to be done. The family's ox is harnessed to an iron-tipped plough, one of those innovations that iron made possible, and you head to the fields. Ploughing is rhythmic work. The ox walks, the plough cuts through the earth, and you follow behind, keeping the plough steady and occasionally clearing rocks and roots from the blade. It's the kind of work that lets your mind wander, while your body does what it knows how to do. The smell of fresh turned earth is one of those scents that reaches something deep in human memory. It smells like possibility, like potential, like the promise that these seeds you're about to plant will become food. Celtic farmers know their land intimately, which fields flood in heavy rain, which dry out too quickly, and where the soil is richest. This knowledge isn't written down, it's handed down, with a child working alongside a parent, learning through doing. Back at the settlement, other people are engaged in their own tasks. Someone's weaving at the loom, the shuttle passing back and forth in a rhythm older than memory. The weaver is making a cloak, thinking about who will wear it, making it sturdy enough for winter, but not so heavy it can't be worn in spring. The wool has been spun by hand, which took weeks, and the weaving will take weeks more. Nothing is quick, but nothing is rushed either. A smith is working at his forge, and you stop to watch because smith work is always fascinating. Today he's making a knife, not an elaborate ceremonial piece, just a good practical knife for daily use. But even this simple knife will be beautiful, because beauty and functionality aren't separate concepts in Celtic thinking. Why make something ugly when you can make it pleasing to look at? The knife's handle will be carved with a simple pattern. The blade will be balanced and sharp. When someone uses this knife in 20 years, they'll still appreciate how well it fits the hand. Children are playing, always playing. They're racing sticks down the stream that runs past the village, building elaborate rules about which stick wins, and immediately arguing about whether that particular stick crossed the finish line first or second. Older children are helping with adult work, collecting eggs, watching the younger kids, learning to card wool, or helping the smith by pumping the bellows. Work and play blur together in childhood. Late afternoon, people start gathering. Celtic life is communal. Privacy, in the modern sense, barely exists. People cook together, eat together, work together, and talk together. The evening meal is the day's social event. Today, it's a stew made with leeks, beans, and a bit of salt pork for flavor. There's bread, dense and filling, probably a bit coarse by modern standards, but delicious when you're hungry from a day's work. As people eat, they talk. Someone tells a story about tracking a boar through the forest. Someone else complains about a neighbor's cow that keeps breaking through the fence and eating the barley. There's discussion about when to shear the sheep. Someone makes a joke that's probably been making people laugh for generations. Language flows around you. that distinctive Celtic lilt, words that sound like music. After the meal, as darkness falls and the fire is built up again, this is when the bard might begin. Bards are professionals, trained from childhood in the art of memory and verse. This particular bard knows hundreds of stories and thousands of lines of poetry. Tonight he's recounting the genealogy of the local chief, tracing his ancestry back 20 generations to a legendary hero who supposedly fought a giant. Everyone's heard it before, but that's not the point. The point is the hearing itself, the communal experience of sitting together in firelight while words weave pictures in the darkness. The bard's skill is in variation. He tells the same story differently each time, responsive to his audience, adding details or leaving them out, speeding up the boring parts and lingering on the good bits. This is living literature, literature that breathes and changes. It will never be fixed on a page, never be definitive. Each telling is unique, and that's the beauty of it. We need to talk about druids, but let's clear away some misconceptions first. Druids aren't mystical wizard types in robes performing magic under full moons. Well, they might be, but that's not the main point. Druids are intellectuals, priests, judges, teachers, astronomers, and keepers of cultural knowledge. They're the people who have spent 20 years or more memorizing Celtic lore, history, religious practice, and natural law. You're attending a legal dispute somewhere in Celtic Britain. Two farmers claim the same piece of land, both insisting their grandfather's grandfather cleared it and established ownership. There's no written deed, no property records. So how do you settle this? You call in a druid. The druid arrives, and he's older, with the kind of face that suggests he's seen everything and found most of it amusing. He listens to both farmers make their case. He asks questions about landmarks, about where certain old stones are, and about family histories. Then he closes his eyes for a long moment, accessing that vast internal library of memorized knowledge, and finally pronounces judgment based on precedent, on traditional law, and on how similar cases have been settled before. His judgment is binding, not because he has an army to enforce it, but because rejecting a druid's judgment would mean rejecting the entire system that holds society together. It would mean putting yourself outside the community, and in Celtic society, that's not survivable. The farmer who loses the dispute might grumble, but he accepts it because the alternative is unthinkable. Druids also handle religious matters, which in Celtic society means everything from blessing crops to interpreting omens to conducting sacrifices. The Celts worship many gods, most of whom are associated with natural features or human activities. There's a god of the forge, a goddess of the river, and deities associated with war, healing, fertility, and wisdom. These gods don't live on some distant mountain. They're here, in the landscape, in daily life. Certain places are especially sacred, springs where the water emerges from the earth, groves of ancient oaks, and hilltops where you can see forever. At these places, people leave offerings, coins thrown into the spring, weapons deliberately broken and buried, and valuable objects given to the gods with no expectation of return. Archaeologists, centuries later, will find these offerings and puzzle over why anyone would throw perfectly good swords into bogs. The answer is devotion and the creation of sacred space where the human and divine worlds touch. The druids oversee the calendar too, determining when festivals should be held. The Celtic year is divided by 4 major festivals, marking the turning of the seasons. Samhain, in late October, is when the boundary between the living and the dead becomes thin. Imbolc, in early February, marks the first stirrings of spring. Beltane, in May, celebrates fertility and growth. Lugnasad in August is the harvest festival. These aren't just parties, though they are parties. They're times when the community comes together to mark the passage of time, to remember the dead, to celebrate the living, and to acknowledge that they're part of something larger than themselves, part of the eternal cycle of seasons and years. The druids also teach, taking on students who will study for decades to learn what the druids know. These students memorize epic poems, legal codes, genealogies, astronomical observations, herbal medicine, and religious rituals. All of this without writing it down, because the druids believe, perhaps rightly, that written words are dead words, fixed and unchanging, while memorized knowledge lives and breathes. There's something remarkable about a culture that can maintain such sophisticated knowledge without writing. It requires a different kind of mind, one trained from childhood to remember, to connect, to recall vast amounts of information and deploy it when needed. We've lost this capacity, mostly, in our written and now digital age, but the druids possessed it, and it served Celtic society well for centuries. The year is 58 BCE, and everything is about to change. Gaius Julius Caesar has been appointed governor of Transalpine Gaul, and he's ambitious in that particularly Roman way, where ambitious means willing to conquer entire peoples to advance your political career. You're in a Gaulish village, and you've been hearing troubling news from the south. Roman armies, disciplined and relentless in a way that Celtic warriors aren't, have been moving through Gaul. They don't fight like Celts fight. Celts favor individual combat, champions stepping forward to duel, and warfare as a kind of deadly sport. Romans fight in formation, each soldier part of a larger machine, grinding forward with methodical efficiency. The Roman advance is marked by a strange mix of violence and administration. They destroy villages that resist, but they also build roads, establish markets, and bring Mediterranean goods, wine, olive oil, and fine pottery. Some Celtic nobles make deals with Rome, seeing opportunity in alliance. Others resist, and their resistance is crushed. The thing is, the Celts might have stopped Rome if they'd been unified, but unity was never the Celtic way. Each tribe makes its own decision. Some fight, some submit, and some try to play Rome off against rival tribes. Celtic political fragmentation, which worked fine in a world of other Celtic tribes, becomes fatal when facing an organized imperial power. You hear about the battle at Alesia, where the Gaulish leader Vercingetorix made a last stand. Caesar besieged him in a hill fort, and when a massive relief army arrived, Caesar built fortifications facing both inward and outward, simultaneously besieging Vercingetorix and defending against the relief force. It was a brilliant, brutal piece of military engineering. When it was over, Gaul was finished as an independent Celtic land. But here's the interesting part. Roman conquest doesn't erase Celtic culture. It transforms it. Latin becomes the prestige language, but people still speak Celtic at home. Roman gods are identified with Celtic ones in a kind of religious syncretism. Towns grow up where villages were, with Roman-style buildings and Celtic roundhouses side by side. Celtic nobles send their sons to study in Rome, and they come back speaking Latin and wearing togas, but they're still Celts underneath. In Britain, the process is similar but slower. Rome invades under Claudius in 43 CE. Britain becomes a province, but only the southern and eastern parts really Romanize. The north and west remain stubbornly Celtic. Hadrian eventually builds his wall, essentially admitting that some Celts simply aren't worth the trouble of conquering. Ireland never gets conquered at all. The Romans knew it was there. They called it Hibernia, but they never invaded. Maybe it seemed too far, too poor, too difficult. Whatever the reason, Celtic culture in Ireland continues uninterrupted, evolving on its own terms. This will prove important later. Let's visit Roman Britain around 150 CE, in a town that was a Celtic village a century ago. The transformation is visible everywhere. There's a forum with stone columns where the market used to be. Roman-style houses with painted plaster walls stand beside traditional roundhouses. People wear both togas and traditional Celtic cloaks, sometimes in bewildering combinations. The local magistrate is a Celt whose grandfather fought the Romans. He has a Latin name now, but he still speaks the Celtic language at home. He successfully navigated two worlds, keeping one foot in each culture. His children are learning Latin grammar and rhetoric, but also hearing old Celtic stories from their grandmother. This mixing, this cultural blending, is how the empire actually works at ground level. Not through erasure, but through adaptation. The Celts have given Rome more than they perhaps realize. Celtic metalworking techniques influence Roman craftspeople. Celtic cavalry tactics are adopted by Roman armies. The Celts' knack for making excellent beer spreads through Roman Britain. Wine is prestigious, but beer is cheaper, and many people prefer it anyway. Celtic art, with its curves and spirals, begins showing up in Roman mosaics and metalwork, disguised as decoration, but unmistakably Celtic in spirit. Language persists in place names. Rivers and hills keep their Celtic names even as Latin becomes the official language. Centuries later, these names will still be there, testifying to the people who named them. The Thames, the Severn, London itself. All Celtic names surviving in a Latin and later English-speaking world. In the countryside, far from Roman towns, Celtic life continues with minimal change. Farmers farm the same fields their ancestors farmed. Village life revolves around the same rhythms. The gods might have Roman names in official contexts, but everybody knows who they really are. The old stories are still told, though now they might include a heroic encounter with a Roman legion or two. The druids have been officially banned. Rome distrusts organizations it can't control, but their knowledge persists in unofficial ways. Certain elders know the old laws. Certain poets remember the genealogies. Certain healers use the traditional herbs and treatments. The formal structure of druidic education is gone, but the knowledge seeps through in 1,000 small ways. Now we're going to take a long step forward to the present day and go looking for the Celts in modern Europe. You might think they're gone, erased by Romans, by Germanic migrations, by medieval kingdoms and modern nations. But you'd be wrong. The Celts didn't disappear. They changed, adapted, and persisted. Start in Ireland, the one place that was never conquered by Rome. Irish Gaelic is still spoken, taught in schools, and used in daily life in some Western regions. The language has survived 1,500 years of external pressure. English rule, famine, and emigration. It's still here, a direct descendant of the Celtic languages spoken when Caesar was conquering Gaul. Irish mythology, written down by medieval monks, preserves stories that are fundamentally Celtic. Tales of heroes like Cuchulainn, of the Tuatha De Danann, and of a world where the supernatural and everyday intersect. These stories were old when they were written down, having been passed orally for generations before anyone thought to record them. Move to Scotland, where Scottish Gaelic survives in the Highlands and Islands. It's endangered, certainly, but there are still communities where it's the first language, where children grow up speaking it at home. Celtic patterns still appear in modern Scottish art, in jewellery, and in textiles. The persistence is remarkable. Wales has maintained Welsh, another Celtic language, with perhaps the most success of all. Over 500,000 people speak Welsh today, and it has official status. Welsh television broadcasts exist, and Welsh language schools thrive. The language that was spoken when the Romans arrived is still spoken, evolved but recognizable. Brittany in northwestern France speaks Breton, brought there by Celts fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Breton is related to Welsh and Cornish, a piece of living linguistic history. It struggled in recent decades against French cultural dominance, but revival efforts are underway. Even in England, which is thoroughly Germanized linguistically, Celtic traces remain. Those place names we mentioned, dozens of rivers called Avon, meaning simply river in Celtic, and countless hills and towns with Celtic origin names. The landscape itself remembers. Celtic artistic motifs show up in surprising places. That spiral pattern you see in modern jewelry? Celtic. Those interlaced designs? Celtic, by way of early medieval Ireland. The Celts' artistic vocabulary has become part of European aesthetic heritage, often without people realizing its origin. Celtic festivals have persisted too, transformed but recognizable. Halloween is Samhain, the Celtic festival of the dead, with a Christian veneer. May Day celebrations echo Beltane. These aren't conscious survivals. Few people dancing around a maypole think, I'm celebrating a Celtic fertility festival. But the continuity is there if you look for it. The political structure of ancient Celtic society, tribal, decentralized, and based on kinship and personal loyalty rather than abstract citizenship, has echoes in the clan systems that persisted in Scotland and Ireland into the modern era. The emphasis on hospitality, on elaborate gift-giving, and on the importance of one's word, these Celtic values shaped the culture of northwestern Europe in ways that are still visible. As we near the end of our walk through Celtic history, let's think about what this gentle civilization contributed to European culture, not through conquest or empire building, but through the quiet influence of their way of life. The Celts showed that you could have a sophisticated culture without cities, that you could maintain complex knowledge without writing, and that you could organize society around relationships rather than institutions. They demonstrated an approach to life that valued beauty for its own sake, that saw no division between the practical and the aesthetic, and that understood humans as part of nature rather than separate from it. Their art influenced everyone who came after. Those spirals and curves, that sense of flow and movement, that ability to make even a simple tool beautiful. This became part of European aesthetic sensibility. Medieval Irish manuscripts, with their elaborate interlaced patterns, are direct descendants of Celtic artistic traditions. The Book of Kells is a Celtic masterpiece, created 1,000 years after the classical Celtic period ended. The Celtic approach to storytelling, oral, flexible, participatory, shaped European narrative traditions. The medieval romances about King Arthur? That's Celtic storytelling filtered through French and English writers. The emphasis on heroes, on loyalty, on the tragic impossibility of perfection, these are Celtic narrative concerns. Celtic attitudes toward the natural world, the sense that the land itself is sacred, that certain places are holy, and that spirits inhabit the landscape. This animistic worldview persisted long after official Christianization. Holy wells, sacred groves, pilgrimages to hilltops. These practices continued with Christian rather than pagan explanations, but the underlying sensibility is Celtic. The druids' approach to knowledge and the emphasis on memory and oral tradition shaped early medieval Irish Christianity in particular. Irish monks became famous for their learning, their manuscript illumination, and their preservation of classical texts. They carried this love of knowledge, learned from druids, adapted to Christian purposes. back to continental Europe during the early Middle Ages, helping to preserve learning during difficult centuries. Celtic languages influenced the Romance languages, spoken in former Celtic territories. French, Spanish, and Portuguese all have Celtic substrate elements, words and grammar quirks that come from the Celtic languages spoken in these regions before Latin arrived. The influence is subtle but real, a linguistic ghost haunting the modern languages of Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the Celts demonstrated a way of being European that wasn't Roman or Germanic, a third option, a different way of organizing society and thinking about the world. They showed that you could be sophisticated without being imperial, civilized without being militaristic, and cultured without building vast centralized states. As our hour together draws to a close, you're standing again in that misty clearing where we started. But now you're seeing it differently. You understand that this place, these people, isn't isolated or primitive. They're part of a vast cultural tradition that will spread across Europe and persist for millennia. The Celts never built an empire, never conquered distant lands, and never imposed their language and culture through military force. They simply lived, farmed, made beautiful things, told stories, and passed their culture from generation to generation. And that turned out to be enough. Not enough to avoid being conquered by Rome, perhaps, but enough to outlast Rome in other ways, to leave traces that remain visible 2,000 years later. When you visit Ireland and hear someone speaking Irish Gaelic, you're hearing a Celtic language. When you see Celtic patterns in jewelry or artwork, you're seeing an aesthetic tradition thousands of years old. When you encounter attitudes toward hospitality, storytelling, or the natural world in northwestern Europe, you're often encountering ideas that have Celtic roots. The Celts remind us that there are many ways to be civilized, many ways to build a culture, and many ways to live meaningfully. They remind us that beauty matters, that stories matter, that relationships matter, and that the land itself matters. They remind us that sometimes the loudest cultures in history, the ones that build the biggest monuments and conquer the most territory, aren't necessarily the ones with the most lasting influence. The Celtic civilization shaped Europe quietly, like water shaping stone, persistent and patient. And if you know how to look, you can still see their influence everywhere, hiding in plain sight, in place names and languages, in artistic motifs and cultural attitudes, and in the very landscape of northwestern Europe. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself in that Celtic village, with firelight flickering on roundhouse walls, the smell of wood smoke and cooking, and the sound of voices speaking a language old beyond measure, telling stories that will be told again tomorrow and the day after and down through the years, persistent and gentle as rain, shaping the world through the simple act of continuing, of being, of remembering. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full of ancient forests, spiral patterns, and the quiet wisdom of a people who knew that the best way to change the world is simply to live well in it.